In
I
the
remember
quiet
the day
suburb
we
of
first
Oakwood
met
Hills,
like it
where
was
success was
yesterday.
measured in square footage
The
and
world
luxury
seemed to
cars,
stop,
Robert
and it
Wilson
was
stood at
just
the
the
window
two of
of his
us.
downtown office.
I remember
At
the day the
68,
war
his
ended,
weathered face carried the marks of a
not
man
with
who
a
had built an
bang,
empire from dust
but
and
with a whisper.
determination. The Chicago skyline stretched before him, a
It all
testament to his
started
legacy.
on a cold
Wilson
winter's night,
Construction, once a one-man
much like this
operation with
one.
nothing but a borrowed truck and unbridled ambition, now a titan of the Midwest construction industry. Robert's fingers traced the edge of the silver picture frame on his desk, a portrait of Eleanor, his wife of 40 years, who had left this world 5 years ago. Cancer had taken her swiftly, leaving a void that seemed to expand with each passing day. Her final words still echoed in his mind, "Take care of James. He needs your guidance more than he knows." James, their only son, now 42, had been groomed since childhood to inherit the Wilson empire. Harvard Business School executive training programs, a carefully curated path to success. Robert had spared no expense, cut no corners in preparing his son for leadership. For the past 3 years, James had served as CEO, while Robert maintained his position as chairman of the board and majority shareholder. The transition had been smooth on paper, but something felt increasingly off in their relationship. The intercom buzzed, pulling Robert from his thoughts. "Mr. Wilson, your son is here for your 2 o'clock. Send him in, Margaret." James Wilson entered the office with the confident stride of a man accustomed to commanding attention. Tailored Italian suit designer watched the practiced smile of someone who had mastered the art of corporate charm. He was his father's son in appearance, the same strong jaw, the same piercing blue eyes, but lacked the calluses that still marked Robert's hands. "Dad, you wanted to see me about the Riverside project." "Sit down, James. I've been reviewing the proposals." James took a seat, instantly checking his phone. Robert noticed the subtle dismissal. These small gestures had been accumulating like raindrops before a flood. "I've made a decision," Robert said, placing a leather portfolio on the desk between them. "I'm going to transfer an additional 15% of company shares to you after the new year. That will give you 40% ownership of Wilson Construction." James looked up, genuine surprise crossing his face. "Really? That's unexpected." "With one condition," Robert added. "You need to demonstrate your commitment to the company's values. I've built this business on relationships and integrity, not just profit margins." "Dad, our quarterly earnings are up 17%. The Riverside development will be the largest in the company's history. What more do you want?" Robert leaned forward. "There's more to running this company than impressive numbers, James. You've been making decisions unilaterally, changing policies I've had in place for decades, pushing out employees who've been loyal to Wilson Construction since before you could tie your shoes." James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm modernizing the company. Some of those policies were outdated, and some of those employees were resistant to necessary changes. Like Thomas Reynolds, 30 years with the company, and you let him go with barely 2 weeks' notice. Thomas was inefficient. His department was underperforming. His wife was battling stage 4 breast cancer. He needed flexibility, not termination." James checked his watch. "Dad, I have a conference call in 20 minutes. Did you need something else?" Robert studied his son, searching for some glimpse of the boy who once followed him around construction sites with wide-eyed wonder. "Christmas is next week. Eleanor always made it special for us. I was thinking we could honor that tradition." "Of course," James replied, his tone softening slightly. "Sarah's handling the arrangements. We're having dinner at our house on Christmas Eve. The kids are excited to see you." "I've missed them. Nathan must be, 15 now, and Emily 12. "Yes, growing like weeds. Nathan's taking advanced placement classes, talking about engineering programs already." Pride warmed Robert's voice, just like his grandfather. "And Emily, still obsessed with those piano lessons you insisted on paying for. She's actually getting quite good." Robert smiled, genuine happiness breaking through his concern. "I'll bring them something special. Nothing too extravagant, Dad. Sarah and I are trying to teach them the value of money." Robert nearly laughed at the irony. James, who had never wanted for anything lecturing about the value of money. Instead, he simply nodded. "I'll see you Christmas Eve then, 7 o'clock. 6:30 would be better. Sarah has the whole evening planned." After James left, Robert turned back to the window, watching his son stride confidently to his Italian sports car in the executive parking lot. The distance between them seemed to grow with each passing year. Robert had built an empire for his family, but he sometimes wondered if the price had been too high. Christmas Eve arrived with a gentle snowfall that blanketed Chicago in pristine white. Robert stood before his closet, selecting a dark green cashmere sweater that Eleanor had given him years ago for the occasion. For the grandchildren, he had chosen gifts with care: a professional telescope for Nathan, who showed such promise in mathematics and science, and a leather-bound collection of classical sheet music for Emily, whose small fingers were already dancing across piano keys with surprising dexterity. As an afterthought, he selected a bottle of Chateau Margaux 1995 from his wine cellar, an exceptional vintage he had been saving for a special occasion. James appreciated fine wine, one of the few passions they still shared. The drive to his son's Lakeshore Drive mansion took longer than expected due to the snow. The house stood illuminated against the darkening sky, a modern architectural marvel of glass and steel that James had commissioned 3 years ago. So different from the warm brick colonial where they had raised him. Robert parked his Mercedes behind an unfamiliar luxury sedan in the driveway. Perhaps Sarah's parents were visiting? He gathered the carefully wrapped presents and wine, then made his way to the front door. Before he could ring the bell, the door flew open and 2 excited children burst forth. "Grandpa Robert!" Emily threw her arms around his waist, nearly toppling him backward into the snow. Nathan, now almost as tall as Robert, approached with the self-conscious restraint of adolescence, but his smile was genuine. "Hey, Grandpa, need help with those packages?" "I wouldn't turn down assistance from a strapping young man," Robert replied, handing the heavier telescope to his grandson. "You've grown another 2 inches since Thanksgiving." 3 inches, actually," Nathan corrected with teenage precision. "Dad says I'll be taller than him by next year." Inside the house was immaculate and decorated with tasteful holiday arrangements that spoke more of professional design than family tradition. The scent of roast lamb and rosemary filled the air, mingling with the subtle aroma of cinnamon and pine. Sarah Wilson greeted him in the foyer, her practiced smile not quite reaching her eyes. At 38, she remained strikingly beautiful, though there was always something calculated in her demeanor that made Robert slightly uncomfortable. "Robert, so glad you made it through the snow." She air-kissed his cheek, careful not to smudge her perfect makeup. "James is in the kitchen finalizing the wine selections." "I brought a little contribution," Robert said, offering the bottle. "How thoughtful. I'm sure it will pair wonderfully with our meal." She took the bottle without examining the label, placing it on a side table as if it were a supermarket selection. Robert followed her into the expansive open-concept living area, noting immediately that the dining table was set for 8, not the expected 6. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, reflecting tiny rainbows across the pristine white tablecloth. "Are we expecting additional guests?" he asked casually. Sarah glanced at the table. "Yes, my father will be joining us tonight, and his companion." Robert nodded, though something in her tone suggested this was more significant than a casual addition. Sarah's father was George Harrison, a 72-year-old real estate magnate whose business practices had always struck Robert as questionable at best. They had crossed paths at various industry events over the years, maintaining a cordial but distant relationship. James emerged from the kitchen, a glass of scotch already in hand. "Dad, you made it. Traffic must be terrible out there." "Nothing I couldn't handle." Robert embraced his son briefly, noting the stiffness in James's posture. "Merry Christmas, son." "Merry Christmas." James stepped back quickly. "I see you've brought gifts for the kids. They've been talking about nothing else all week." "Can we open them now, Dad? Please." Emily tugged at her father's sleeve. "After dinner, sweetheart. Grandpa Harrison will be here any minute, and we want to be ready to greet him properly." Robert noted the formality in James's voice when mentioning George. There was something deferential there, almost rehearsed. "You always let us open one gift on Christmas Eve," Nathan pointed out. "That's the tradition." James shot his son a warning glance. "Not tonight, Nathan. We have a special dinner planned." The doorbell rang and Sarah's posture immediately straightened. "That must be Father. James, would you—" James moved with unusual haste to answer the door, straightening his tie as he went. Robert exchanged a puzzled look with his grandchildren, who seemed equally confused by their father's behavior. Voices echoed from the foyer. James's overly enthusiastic greeting followed by the deep, authoritative tones of George Harrison. A moment later, they entered the living room. George Harrison cut an impressive figure despite his age. Tall and distinguished with a full head of silver hair, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to deference. Beside him was a significantly younger woman, perhaps in her late 40s, draped in expensive jewelry that caught the light with every movement. "Mr. Harrison, what a pleasure to have you join us," James said, his voice pitched higher than normal. "Please come in. Let me take your coat." Robert watched this display with growing bewilderment. James had never shown such deference to anyone, including his own father. "George, Merry Christmas." Sarah greeted her father with a kiss on the cheek. "And Vanessa, lovely to see you again." George nodded approvingly at the decorations. "You've outdone yourself this year, Sarah. Very elegant." His eyes finally fell on Robert. "Wilson, didn't expect to see you here." "It's Christmas, George. Where else would I be but with my family?" Robert extended his hand, which George shook with perfunctory politeness. "Robert, this is Vanessa Reynolds, my companion." George introduced the woman at his side, who offered a manicured hand and practiced smile. "Charming home your son has," she commented. "George has been telling me about his successful business ventures." James cleared his throat. "Shall we move to the dining room? Sarah has prepared an exceptional meal, and I've selected some outstanding wines to complement each course." The group moved toward the dining table, where James directed everyone to their places with unusual precision. Robert automatically moved toward the head of the table, where he had sat at family gatherings since Eleanor's passing. "Actually, Dad," James said, a strange tension in his voice, "we've arranged seating a bit differently tonight." Robert paused, his hand on the back of the chair. "Oh, Mr. Harrison will be sitting at the head of the table as our guest of honor." A heavy silence fell over the room. Even the children seemed to sense the sudden tension. "I see," Robert said quietly. "And where would you like me to sit?" James gestured to a chair halfway down the table between Emily and Vanessa. "I thought you might be comfortable there." Robert remained standing, his hands still resting on the chair at the head of the table. "James, I've sat in this seat at every family dinner since your mother passed. It's tradition." George Harrison stood awkwardly near the chair, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and something else, a faint satisfaction that disturbed Robert deeply. "Dad, please don't make this difficult," James said, lowering his voice. "It's just a seat." "If it's just a seat, then why change things now?" Robert asked, his voice level but firm. Sarah intervened, her voice honeyed with forced pleasantness. "Robert, we thought it would be a nice gesture to honor my father this evening. He's recently helped James with some important business connections." Robert looked from Sarah to James, then to George, whose smug expression had become increasingly apparent. "I see. Business connections that require disrupting family traditions." "Dad," James stepped closer, speaking through clenched teeth. "Just move to the other seat. You're embarrassing me in front of George." "I'm embarrassing you?" Robert asked quietly. The children watched the exchange with wide eyes. Nathan had moved protectively closer to his sister, his teenage face clouded with confusion and discomfort. "Mr. Wilson," George interjected, "perhaps it would be simpler if I sat elsewhere." "No," James cut him off. "This is my house, and I've decided on the seating arrangements." He turned back to his father, his voice hardening. "Dad, I need you to move, now." Robert stood his ground, more confused than angry. "James, what's gotten into you? This isn't like you." Something snapped in James's expression. In one swift motion, he moved behind his father and placed his hands on Robert's shoulders, pushing him with unexpected force. Robert, unprepared for the assault, lost his balance and tumbled to the floor, his hip striking the hardwood with a painful thud. A collective gasp filled the room. Emily screamed while Nathan rushed to his grandfather's side. "Dad, what the hell?" Nathan's teenage voice cracked with outrage. "Grandpa, are you okay?" Emily was on the verge of tears. From his position on the floor, Robert looked up at his son with an expression of complete disbelief. James stood over him, breathing heavily, a flush of anger still coloring his face. "This seat belongs to George," James said, his voice cold and unfamiliar. "You need to know your place." In that moment, as Robert sat stunned on the hardwood floor of his son's dining room, something fundamental shifted inside him. The pain in his hip was nothing compared to the searing betrayal that burned through his chest. He'd given everything to his son, his knowledge, his company, his legacy. And in return, James had just publicly humiliated him in front of his family. Nathan helped him to his feet, the boy's hands gentle but trembling with emotion. "Are you hurt, Grandpa?" Robert straightened his sweater, his dignity gathering around him like armor. "I'm fine, Nathan. Thank you." The dining room remained frozen in shock. Sarah stood with one hand covering her mouth, her eyes darting between her husband and father. George Harrison had taken a seat, not at the head of the table but in a chair to the side, clearly uncomfortable with the scene that had unfolded. Vanessa studied her manicure with sudden, intense interest. Only James seemed unmoved, gesturing to the chair he'd indicated earlier. "Your seat is there, Dad." Robert looked at his son as if seeing him for the first time, a stranger wearing familiar features. Without another word, he walked to the indicated chair and sat down, his back straight, his expression unreadable. Dinner proceeded in a fog of tension and artificial conversation. Sarah served the lamb, which no one seemed to truly taste. George and James dominated the conversation, discussing business opportunities and market trends as if nothing unusual had occurred. The children remained silent, picking at their food, occasionally glancing at their grandfather with worried expressions. "The merger possibilities between Harrison Properties and Wilson Construction are extraordinary," George was saying, gesturing with his wine glass. "Our combined assets would dominate the Chicago market." "Exactly," James nodded enthusiastically. "The synergies make perfect sense." "Merger," Robert spoke for the first time since taking his seat. "This is the first I'm hearing of any merger discussions." James barely glanced in his direction. "It's preliminary, Dad. Nothing to concern yourself with." "As chairman of the board and majority shareholder, I would think merger discussions would very much concern me," Robert replied evenly. A flicker of annoyance crossed James's face. "We're just exploring possibilities, Dad. The actual paperwork and approvals would come later, of course." "Of course," George interjected smoothly. "James has simply been proactive in identifying growth opportunities. As CEO, that's his responsibility." "Indeed," Robert said carefully, placing his fork beside his barely touched lamb. "Though traditionally major strategic decisions involve the chairman and the board from the earliest stages." James's smile tightened. "Business practices evolve, Dad. Modern companies need agility, not bureaucracy. Modern companies also need ethical leadership and respect for established governance," Robert countered. An uncomfortable silence descended on the table. "Who wants dessert?" Sarah interjected brightly. "I've made a traditional Christmas pudding." "I'm not feeling well," Emily said suddenly. "May I be excused?" "Me too," Nathan added quickly. "I should help Em with her stuff." James waved dismissively. "Fine, go ahead. But come back down when it's time for coffee." The children practically fled the dining room, casting worried glances at their grandfather as they left. For the remainder of the meal, Robert observed rather than participated. He watched his son perform for George Harrison, noting every obsequious laugh, every deferential nod. He saw Sarah's nervous glances between her husband and father, her practiced smiles failing to mask her discomfort. And he saw something else. The subtle exchange of knowing looks between James and George, suggesting a deeper understanding than a casual business relationship would warrant. When the meal finally concluded, Robert stood. "I think I should be going." "So early?" Sarah asked, though relief flickered across her face. "You usually stay for coffee and dessert." "I have some important matters to attend to," Robert replied, his voice level. "Thank you for dinner." James made no move to walk his father to the door, continuing his conversation with George as if Robert had already left. It was Nathan who came rushing down the stairs when he heard his grandfather was leaving. "You're going already, Grandpa?" Disappointment etched across the boy's young face. "I'm afraid so, Nathan. But your Christmas gifts are under the tree. Make sure you and Emily open them tomorrow." Nathan lowered his voice, glancing back toward the dining room. "Are you okay? What Dad did, that wasn't right." Robert placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "I'm not upset, Nathan. I'm disappointed. There's a difference. I don't understand what's happening. Dad's been acting weird for weeks, always on the phone with Grandpa Harrison, having secret meetings. Sometimes people make poor choices when they think they're pursuing something valuable," Robert said carefully. "The true test of character is how they respond when they realize their mistake." "Are you and Dad going to be okay?" Robert considered his answer carefully. "That will depend on your father's actions in the coming days. But don't worry about me, Nathan. I've weathered tougher storms than this." The boy hugged him fiercely. "I'll call you tomorrow, okay? I'd like that very much." As Robert drove home through the gently falling snow, his mind was not on the physical humiliation he had suffered, but on the implications of what he had witnessed. The merger discussions, James's obsequious behavior toward George, the subtle exchanges that suggested conspiracy rather than collaboration. Instead of the anger or hurt that might have consumed him, Robert felt a cold clarity descend. James had revealed something fundamental tonight, not just disrespect for his father, but a profound character flaw that threatened everything Robert had built. A line had been crossed, and there could be no going back. When he reached his lakeside home, Robert did not pour himself a drink or succumb to self-pity. Instead, he went directly to his home office and picked up the phone. "Edward, I apologize for calling on Christmas Eve." The voice on the other end belonged to Edward Blackwell, Robert's attorney of 25 years. "I need you to clear your schedule for tomorrow morning. We have urgent work to do." "Robert, what's happened?" "I've just discovered that my son may be conspiring with George Harrison to seize control of Wilson Construction." A long pause followed. "That's a serious allegation, Robert. Are you certain?" "Not yet, but I will be. I need you to conduct a complete review of all company transactions, personnel changes, and board communications for the past 6 months. Look for anything unusual, particularly any interactions with Harrison Properties or its subsidiaries." "That will take time, Robert. It's Christmas." "I understand, and I wouldn't ask if it weren't critical." "Something is happening, Edward. My son—" Robert's voice caught momentarily. "My son is not the man I thought he was." After ending the call, Robert placed a second call to Linda Chen, his chief financial officer and trusted advisor for nearly 2 decades. "Linda, I apologize for disturbing your holiday, but I need your expertise on an urgent matter." By midnight, Robert had initiated a comprehensive investigation into his son's activities at Wilson Construction. Not acting in anger or revenge, but with the methodical precision that had built his empire from nothing. If James had betrayed the company, there would be evidence, and Robert Wilson would find it. As the snow continued to fall outside his window, Robert stood looking at the family photographs arranged on his mantelpiece. James as a toddler on his shoulders, James graduating from Harvard, James on his wedding day with Sarah, the happy facade of a family legacy. "Eleanor," he whispered to his late wife's photograph, "I tried to give him everything, but I may have failed to give him what he needed most. The understanding that true success is built on character, not opportunity." The Christmas lights reflected in the glass of the picture frames, casting colorful shadows across Robert's weathered face. This was not how he had expected to spend Christmas Eve, but perhaps it was necessary. Sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as painful revelations. Robert Wilson had built his company from the ground up with nothing but determination and integrity. If necessary, he was prepared to protect that legacy, even from his own son. The 3 weeks following Christmas passed in a blur of investigation and revelation. Robert threw himself into the task with the same single-minded focus that had built his construction empire. Edward Blackwell coordinated a team of forensic accountants and legal analysts, while Linda Chen provided access to the company's financial systems and records. What they uncovered exceeded Robert's worst suspicions. On the morning of January 15th, Robert sat in his home office reviewing the comprehensive report Edward had delivered. The evidence was irrefutable, laid out in meticulous detail across 43 pages of documentation, financial records, and email transcripts. James had been systematically preparing for a hostile takeover of Wilson Construction for at least 6 months. He had restructured departments, replacing loyal executives with his own people. He had diverted small but significant amounts of company funds through a complex web of transactions that ultimately fed into offshore accounts. Most damning of all, he had secretly converted the company to a limited liability company without proper board approval, using falsified signatures and backdated documents. The goal appeared to be a merger with Harrison Properties that would effectively give control of Wilson Construction to George Harrison, with James serving as figurehead CEO of the combined entity. In return, James would receive significant personal financial compensation and escape the shadow of his father's legacy. Robert's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Linda. "I've completed the analysis you requested, Robert. It's worse than we thought." "Tell me." "James has leveraged almost all of his personal assets against company guarantees. The mortgage on his Lakeshore Drive home, his investment portfolio, even his children's trust funds, all backed by Wilson Construction financial instruments that you co-signed as chairman. Robert pinched the bridge of his nose. And if those guarantees were withdrawn, he'd be in immediate default on approximately $4 million of personal debt. I see. Thank you, Linda. After hanging up, Robert stared out the window at the Chicago skyline, the city where he had built his life's work brick by brick. His son had not just betrayed him personally, he had attempted to steal and dismantle the company that provided livelihoods for over 300 employees. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Wilson, your son has arrived for the meeting. Send him in, Margaret." James entered the office with his usual confidence, dressed immaculately in a custom suit that probably cost more than what many of his employees earned in a month. If he felt any remorse about the Christmas Eve incident, it didn't show on his face. "Dad, you wanted to see me. I have a lunch meeting with the Riverside developers at 1. "Sit down, James." Robert's voice was calm but carried an unfamiliar steel edge. James complied, checking his watch impatiently. "What's this about the quarterly reports aren't due for another 2 weeks?" Robert opened a folder and slid a document across the desk. "Do you recognize this?" James glanced at the paper, his expression unchanged. "It looks like standard LLC conversion paperwork, part of the modernization initiative I mentioned last quarter. Except that the board never approved this conversion. And that's not my signature, though it's designed to appear so." A flicker of unease crossed James's face, quickly masked. "There must be some misunderstanding. The paperwork was handled by legal. If there's an issue with the signatures—" "There is no misunderstanding, James." Robert's voice remained measured. "I have spent the last 3 weeks conducting a comprehensive investigation into your activities as CEO. Would you like to know what I found?" James's facade began to crack slightly. "Dad, if this is about Christmas Eve, I admit I overreacted. The stress of the holidays, the pressure of the Riverside project—" "This is not about Christmas Eve," Robert interrupted. "Though that incident revealed something important about your character that I should have recognized sooner." He opened another folder. "This is about the systematic campaign you've been conducting to undermine my authority and prepare for a hostile takeover of Wilson Construction in partnership with George Harrison." All color drained from James's face. That's absurd. Is it, perhaps you'd like to explain these offshore transfers, or these falsified board minutes, or these email exchanges with George Harrison discussing how to structure the takeover to minimize my ability to block it?" James stared at the evidence before him, his mind visibly racing for a plausible explanation. "Dad, you don't understand modern business practices. Strategic partnerships require discretion. I was only exploring options to grow the company." "Stop lying, James." Robert's voice finally betrayed emotion, not anger but profound disappointment. "You weren't building the company. You were selling it out from under me. You were betraying everything I spent my life creating." James's expression hardened. "Creating for who, Dad?" "For yourself. Your precious legacy." "What about what I want?" "And what is it you want, James, that you don't already have?" "A successful career, financial security, a beautiful family, all provided by the very company you're attempting to steal. Provided by you, always by you." James stood up, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea what it's like living in your shadow? Being Robert Wilson's son, never knowing if anything I achieve is because of my own merit or because of your name, your connections, your money. So your solution was to betray me, to conspire with George Harrison to take what you couldn't build yourself. George recognizes my talents. He sees me as a partner, not as some perpetual child who needs supervision." Robert regarded his son sadly. "George Harrison sees you as a useful tool to acquire a successful company at a fraction of its market value. Once he has control, how long do you think you'll remain CEO?" Uncertainty flickered across James's face. "Did you even read the proposed merger terms? The fine print gives Harrison Properties controlling interest and the ability to replace executive leadership with only 30 days' notice." James sank back into his chair. "You're just trying to maintain control. You've never trusted me to run this company my way." "I trusted you with everything, James. That was my mistake." Robert stood up and walked to the window, his back to his son. "As of this morning, you are no longer CEO of Wilson Construction. The board has voted unanimously to terminate your employment effective immediately. You can't do that. I can and I have. The evidence of financial impropriety and breach of fiduciary duty is overwhelming. You should be grateful I'm not pressing criminal charges. James's shock gave way to panic. Dad, be reasonable. We can work this out. Furthermore, Robert continued as if James hadn't spoken, all financial guarantees provided by Wilson Construction for your personal debts have been revoked. Your banks have been notified and will begin collection proceedings according to the terms of your loan agreements. You're destroying me over a business disagreement. James's voice was incredulous. Robert turned to face his son. This was never about business, James. This was about character, about integrity, about the fundamental values that should guide a man's actions. He returned to his desk and sat down. You have 90 days to settle your outstanding debts before foreclosure proceedings begin on your properties. I suggest you use that time wisely. Dad, please. Think about Sarah, about Nathan and Emily. They don't deserve this. No, they don't. Which is why I've established trust funds for both children that will cover their educational expenses through graduate school. Sarah will need to decide her own path forward. James stood, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and desperation. This isn't over. I'll fight this. With what resources, James, your personal assets are leveraged to the hilt. Your reputation in the industry will be in tatters once the circumstances of your termination become known. George Harrison won't return your calls once he realizes you can no longer deliver Wilson Construction. You cold, heartless bastard. You'd destroy your own son. Robert's expression remained impassive. No, James, you destroyed yourself. I'm simply allowing you to experience the consequences of your actions. This is about Christmas Eve, isn't it? Because I embarrassed you in front of George. Christmas Eve was a symptom, not the disease. It showed me who you've become. Someone willing to humiliate his own father for momentary advantage. Someone who measures respect not by character, but by what others can provide. Robert gestured to the door. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Your company credentials have already been deactivated. James stood frozen, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. Dad, don't do this. It's already done. Robert pressed the intercom button. Margaret, please have security come to my office. As James was led away, Robert remained at his desk, outwardly composed despite the turmoil within. He had just severed ties with his only child, the son he had raised and loved for 42 years. There was no satisfaction in this victory, only a profound sense of failure and loss. The phone rang again. It was Edward. Robert, it's done. The board resolution has been filed. James's termination is official, and Richard Stevens has been appointed interim CEO. Thank you, Edward. Are you all right? This can't have been easy. Robert stared at the family photo on his desk, taken when James was just a boy, sitting proudly on his father's shoulders at a construction site. No, it wasn't easy, but it was necessary. After hanging up, Robert swiveled his chair to face the window, allowing himself a rare moment of emotion. A single tear tracked down his weathered cheek as he mourned not just for the son he had lost, but for the son he had failed to raise with the values he held most dear. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, covering the city in a fresh blanket of white. Perhaps Robert thought there was symbolism in that, the opportunity to start anew, to rebuild what had been damaged, to find a path forward through the coldest of seasons. But some damages could not be repaired, and some betrayals cut too deep for simple forgiveness. James would have to find his own way now without the safety net that had always been there to catch him. For better or worse, Robert Wilson had taught his son the most important lesson of his life. Every action has consequences, and some prices must be paid in full. The January freeze gripped Chicago with icy determination. Snow fell in relentless sheets, covering the city in a pristine blanket that masked the turmoil beneath. For James Wilson, it might as well have been an avalanche. 2 weeks after his unceremonious dismissal from Wilson Construction, James sat in the living room of his Lakeshore Drive mansion, surrounded by the trappings of success that were rapidly slipping through his fingers. The morning's mail lay scattered across the imported marble coffee table, formal notices from banks, investment firms, credit card companies, all bearing the same message: pay immediately or face collection proceedings. The house felt eerily quiet. Sarah had taken the children to her parents' estate in Lake Forest for the weekend, ostensibly to give them space from the tension at home. In reality, James suspected she was already planning her exit strategy. Sarah Harrison had married into success, not failure. James poured himself a third glass of scotch despite the early hour. The amber liquid caught the winter light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased a view he would likely lose within months. His phone buzzed again. Another call from George Harrison. James silenced it without answering. His father-in-law had been attempting to contact him daily since the board meeting that had destroyed his career. What George didn't know was that James had overheard a conversation between his father-in-law and a business associate at the country club 2 days earlier. "Wilson Construction is still on the table," George had said, his voice carrying from behind a row of lockers. "Robert may be stubborn, but he's also pragmatic. Without James muddying the waters, I think we can negotiate a more straightforward partnership." "What about your son-in-law?" the associate had asked. George's laugh had been dismissive cutting. "James was useful when he had access. Now he's a liability. Sarah understands business. She'll make the right decision when the time comes." That conversation had confirmed Robert's warning. George had never seen James as a partner, only as a convenient tool to access Wilson Construction. And now that the tool had broken, it would be discarded without a second thought. The doorbell rang, jarring James from his bitter recollections. He ignored it, assuming it was another courier with legal documents. When it rang again more insistently, he reluctantly made his way to the door. On his doorstep stood Richard Stevens, the longtime COO of Wilson Construction, who had been appointed interim CEO in James's absence. Richard's silver hair was dusted with snow, his expression somber but determined. "We need to talk, James." James stepped aside wordlessly, allowing his former colleague inside. Richard declined the offer of a drink instead, placing a thick manila envelope on the coffee table. "Your father didn't send me," Richard began, removing his gloves methodically. "In fact, he expressly forbade any Wilson Construction executives from contacting you." "Yet here you are," James said flatly, "breaking the king's decree. I've worked for your father for 30 years, watched you grow up, taught you how to read blueprints when you were 10 years old." Richard's weathered face betrayed genuine concern. "I can't just stand by while your life implodes. Did you bring a job offer alone, or just sympathy?" The bitterness in James's voice was palpable. "Information." Richard gestured to the envelope. "And a reality check." Inside the envelope were detailed financial analyses of James's personal situation, mortgage statements, investment accounts, credit reports, all meticulously organized and annotated. "You're 90 days from complete financial collapse," Richard said bluntly. "The mortgage forbearance ends March 15th. Without your Wilson Construction income and with your personal guarantees revoked, you'll default on approximately $4.6 million in debt." "I'm aware of my situation, Richard." "Are you?" Richard leaned forward. "Because you're still living like nothing's changed. The house, the cars, the country club membership, you're hemorrhaging cash with no income to replace it." "I have options." "No, James, you don't." Richard's voice sharpened. "Every construction firm in Chicago knows what happened. George Harrison has already distanced himself publicly. Your reputation in the industry is toxic." James stared at his former mentor, a mixture of anger and desperation rising in his chest. "Why are you really here to gloat? To help you salvage something from this disaster?" Richard pulled another document from his briefcase. "This is an offer for your Aspen vacation property. It's below market value, but it's cash, and it would buy you time to sell this house on your terms instead of losing it to foreclosure." James took the document, scanning it quickly. "Who's the buyer?" "An LLC, anonymous investor." Richard's expression remained neutral. "The offer expires in 48 hours. The implication hung in the air between them. James wasn't naive enough to believe his father wasn't somehow connected to this unexpected lifeline, but pride warred with pragmatism as he considered his rapidly diminishing options. "Why would my father help me after everything that's happened?" "I didn't say it was your father." Richard stood, retrieving his coat. "But whoever it is, they're offering you a chance to avoid a very public and humiliating bankruptcy. I'd consider it carefully." After Richard left, James returned to the financial documents spread across the table. For the first time, he forced himself to truly confront the precarious state of his finances. The numbers were irrefutable. Without immediate action, he would lose everything. Not in some distant future, but within weeks. He picked up his phone and dialed Sarah. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice cool and distant. "The children are skating with my parents. Can this wait?" "No, it can't." James took a deep breath. We need to talk about our financial situation. It's worse than I initially thought. Sarah's sigh was barely audible. James, my father already explained everything. The banks have contacted us directly about the mortgage. Us, me. The correction was swift and deliberate. They contacted me as co-signer. Sarah, we need to make decisions together. This is our life, our family. No, James, her voice hardened. This was your decision. When you pushed your father to the floor at Christmas, when you conspired with my father behind Robert's back, when you jeopardized everything for your ego, those were your decisions, not ours. The silence that followed felt like a physical presence. The children and I will be staying with my parents for the foreseeable future, Sarah continued. My attorney will contact you next week regarding separation proceedings. Sarah, please. Goodbye, James. The line went dead, leaving James staring at his phone in disbelief. His wife of 16 years had just effectively ended their marriage in a 30-second phone call. No discussion, no opportunity for explanation or redemption. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent to the human drama unfolding behind glass and stone facades. James moved to the liquor cabinet, then stopped, his hand hovering over the crystal decanter. Drowning his sorrows wouldn't solve anything. For the first time in weeks, clarity pierced through his self-pity. He returned to Richard's offer for the Aspen property. It wasn't charity, it was a business transaction that would provide immediate liquidity. Swallowing his pride, James signed the acceptance papers and scanned them to the email address provided. Within minutes, his phone pinged with confirmation of receipt. That evening, as darkness settled over the city, James methodically began cataloging the contents of his home, identifying items that could be sold quickly. Designer furniture, art collections, his wine cellar, all the status symbols he'd accumulated over years of privilege. Each item represented a decision, a priority that now seemed hollow in the face of financial ruin. His phone buzzed with an incoming call. Nathan. James answered immediately. Dad, are you okay? His son's voice carried an unfamiliar concern, making him sound older than his 15 years. I'm fine, Nathan. How's the skating? It was okay. Nathan paused. Mom says we're staying at Grandpa Harrison's for a while. Just until we sort some things out. Another pause. She's talking about moving us to their guest house. Permanently. James closed his eyes, the full weight of his situation crashing down on him. Nathan, I need you to know something. Whatever happens between your mother and me, whatever you hear about the company or about what I did, I love you and Emily more than anything in this world. Dad, why did you push Grandpa Robert? The question was direct, honest, in the way only teenagers can be. That wasn't like you. The simplicity of the question pierced James more deeply than any legal notice or financial threat. His son wasn't asking about business strategies or corporate politics. He wanted to understand the moral failure he had witnessed. I made a terrible mistake, Nathan. I was trying to impress your Grandpa Harrison, trying to prove something, and I disrespected the man who gave me everything. James's voice cracked slightly. It was wrong. Completely wrong. Can't you just apologize to him? It's not that simple. Some actions can't be undone with just words. So what are you going to do? The question hung in the air. What was he going to do? Continue wallowing in self-pity? Fight a legal battle he couldn't win? Run from his responsibilities? I'm going to face the consequences of my actions, James finally said, and try to rebuild what I can, starting with your trust. After saying goodbye to Nathan, James sat in the darkening room. The city lights spread before him like distant stars. The conversation with his son had shifted something fundamental within him. For weeks he had been focused solely on what he had lost, his job, his status, his wealth. Not once had he truly considered the moral dimension of his actions or their impact on those around him, particularly his children. The realization was uncomfortable, even painful, but it carried a clarity that had been missing since that fateful Christmas Eve. The next morning, James contacted a real estate agent about listing the Lakeshore Drive property. The agent was brutally honest. Given the current market and the property's high carrying costs, James would likely have to accept a significant loss to sell quickly. James authorized an aggressive pricing strategy, prioritizing speed over profit. His next call was to his Mercedes dealer, arranging to sell back his S-Class and his wife's GLE SUV. By noon, he had canceled country club memberships, subscription services, and the army of service providers who maintained his luxury lifestyle. The personal trainer, the weekly cleaning service, the lawn care company. Each call, each cancellation felt like severing a piece of his former identity. Yet strangely, there was also a sense of relief. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, James was making decisions based not on appearance or status, but on hard reality. 3 days after signing the Aspen property documents, James received confirmation that $1.2 million had been deposited into his account. Less than the property was worth, but enough to stabilize his immediate financial crisis and negotiate with his most pressing creditors. That same afternoon, he received an unexpected visitor at his door. Linda Chen, the CFO of Wilson Construction and his father's trusted financial advisor. Her expression was professional, but guarded as she handed him a sealed envelope. "Your father asked me to deliver this personally," she said, declining his invitation to step inside. "Is he?" James began. "He's not interested in communication, James, just delivering documents." Linda's tone made it clear she shared Robert's sentiment. The contents are self-explanatory. After she left, James opened the envelope to find a formal acknowledgement of his resignation from all positions at Wilson Construction, along with documentation terminating his participation in company health insurance and retirement programs. There was also a certified check for $145,000, the exact amount of his vested benefits in the company pension plan. No personal note, no message of any kind, just the cold, efficient settlement of outstanding business. James placed the check with the others he'd received that week. He was now officially and completely severed from Wilson Construction, the company that had defined his professional identity since graduation. The company his father had built from nothing, that had been intended as his inheritance, was now as inaccessible to him as if it belonged to a stranger. That evening, James received a text from Emily, a photo of her playing piano in George Harrison's ornate living room accompanied by a simple message, "Miss you, Daddy." The photo revealed more than his 12-year-old daughter likely intended. In the background, visible through an open doorway, James could see Sarah engaged in conversation with his father-in-law and another man he recognized as Philip Denning, a prominent divorce attorney known for representing high-net-worth clients. The implications were clear. Sarah wasn't simply separating from him. She was preparing for a comprehensive legal strategy to protect her financial interests. James couldn't blame her, not really. She had built her life around certain expectations: social status, financial security, the prestige of being married to a successful executive. He had jeopardized all of that through his own actions. James texted back a heart emoji and a promise to see Emily soon, though he had no idea how or when that might be possible. His life had become a series of uncertainties each day, bringing new evidence of how quickly a seemingly solid existence could crumble. 2 weeks later, James sat in a modestly furnished apartment in Rogers Park, far from the lakefront luxury he had known. Most of his possessions were gone, sold, stored, or claimed by Sarah through her attorney. The Lakeshore Drive house was under contract, though at a price that would barely cover the mortgage. His expensive watches, designer wardrobe, and art collection had been liquidated to generate cash. What remained filled only a fraction of the 900-square-foot apartment he now called home. The transformation had been swift and brutal. In just 30 days, James Wilson had gone from CEO of a major construction company to an unemployed divorcee living in a neighborhood he would have previously avoided. Yet beneath the shock and humiliation, something unexpected was emerging, a strange sense of liberation. Without the constant pressure to maintain appearances, without the corporate politics and family expectations, James found himself thinking more clearly than he had in years. For the first time, he was forced to consider who he was apart from his father's company, his wife's social connections, and the material trappings of success. The answer was unsettling. He wasn't entirely sure. His phone rang, an unknown number. James hesitated, then answered. "James Wilson." "Mr. Wilson, this is Thomas Reynolds." The name took a moment to register. Thomas Reynolds, the longtime Wilson Construction employee James had fired shortly before Christmas for underperformance. "Thomas, this is unexpected." "I imagine so." The man's voice betrayed no emotion. "I heard about your situation. News travels fast in this industry." James braced himself for recrimination or gloating. "What can I do for you, Thomas?" "Actually, I was wondering what I might do for you." A pause. My wife finished her final round of chemotherapy last week. The prognosis is good. I'm glad to hear that. Your father rehired me, did you know, with back pay and a promotion. Said my experience was too valuable to lose. James closed his eyes, another twist of the knife. That sounds like him. He also told me what happened at Christmas and about the attempted takeover. Thomas, if you called to. I called because I know what it's like to hit rock bottom, Thomas interrupted. When Jennifer was diagnosed, I thought my world was ending. Couldn't focus, couldn't sleep, could barely function. That's why my performance slipped. James remained silent, shame washing over him anew. I'm not calling to rub salt in your wounds, Thomas continued. I'm calling because Stevenson Builders is looking for a project manager. It's entry-level, nothing like what you're used to, but it's a foot in the door. I put in a good word for you. James was momentarily speechless. Why would you help me after what I did to you? Because your father helped me when I needed it most, and because holding grudges takes too much energy. Thomas's voice softened slightly. Look, I'm not saying it'll be easy. Stanley Stevenson knows your history, and he'll be watching you closely. But it's honest work in the industry, you know. After the call ended, James sat staring at his phone, trying to process what had just happened. Thomas Reynolds, a man he had fired without consideration during one of the most difficult periods of his life, had just offered him a professional lifeline. The irony was almost painful. The same week his wife had formally filed for divorce, a virtual stranger had shown him more compassion than he probably deserved. The following Monday, James presented himself at the modest offices of Stevenson Builders, a mid-sized construction company specializing in municipal projects. His suit was off the rack, his watch a simple Timex, all visible symbols of his former life sold or in storage. Stanley Stevenson, a burly man in his 60s with calloused hands and no pretensions, studied James with undisguised skepticism. Thomas vouched for you, which counts for something. But let's be clear. I'm not hiring James Wilson, former CEO. I'm hiring someone to manage the West Side Library renovation period. I understand. The pay is $75,000 annually, standard benefits, no executive perks, no corner office, no administrative assistant. That's fair. You'll report directly to our head of operations, who's 34 and has never attended an Ivy League school. Stevenson leaned forward. Can your ego handle that? James met the man's gaze directly. Mr. Stevenson, 30 days ago I was worth 8 figures on paper. Today I can barely make rent. My ego isn't just bruised, it's been completely dismantled. Good. Stevenson slid a contract across the desk. Because I don't care about your family name or your MBA. I care about getting projects done on time and under budget. Prove you can do that and we'll get along fine. James signed the contract without hesitation. The salary was less than 1/10 of what he had earned at Wilson Construction, but it was a beginning, a chance to rebuild something from the ruins of his former life. The first week at Stevenson Builders was a harsh education in humility. James, who had been accustomed to delegating actual construction oversight, found himself conducting daily site visits, negotiating directly with subcontractors, and personally reviewing every change order. His hands, soft from years of office work, developed blisters from handling blueprints and climbing through partially constructed spaces. His colleagues maintained a professional but cool distance, clearly aware of his background and skeptical of his commitment. Only Thomas, who occasionally consulted on electrical systems for Stevenson, offered friendly conversation during site visits. On Friday afternoon, as James was reviewing material deliveries for the following week, his phone rang. It was Nathan. Dad, can I see you this weekend? His son's voice was tentative. Mom said I have to ask you directly. Of course, Nathan. I'd love that. James felt a surge of hope. Would you like to come to my apartment? Or we could meet somewhere else if that's more comfortable. Your apartment is fine. Emily wants to come too. Both of you. James couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. That would be wonderful. Mom said we need her permission first, but she'd probably say yes if you ask her. I'll call her right away. The conversation with Sarah was brief and businesslike. She agreed to allow the children to visit on Saturday afternoon with the stipulation that James return them to Lake Forest by 8 p.m. It was a small concession, but it felt like a significant victory. James spent Friday evening frantically preparing his modest apartment, purchasing groceries, and making sure the spare bedroom was suitable for his children's visit. The limitations of his new living situation were starkly apparent as he tried to create a welcoming space with minimal resources. The folding table that served as his dining area seemed especially inadequate compared to the custom-made cherry wood table they had left behind. Saturday dawned bright and clear, a perfect Chicago spring day. James waited anxiously outside his building, watching for Sarah's car. When it appeared at the end of the block, his heart raced with a mixture of joy and apprehension. Nathan emerged first, tall and somewhat awkward in the way of 15-year-old boys. Emily followed, her expression brightening when she spotted her father. Sarah remained in the car, acknowledging James with only the briefest nod before driving away. The apartment tour took less than 2 minutes. Emily's eyes widened at the modest surroundings while Nathan observed everything with careful neutrality. "It's cozy," Emily offered, clearly searching for something positive to say. "It's small but functional," James acknowledged, determined to be honest with his children. "Not what we're used to, but it's home for now." They settled around the folding table with pizza James had ordered, a casual meal that would have been unthinkable in their former life where every family dinner had been a carefully orchestrated event. "How's school going?" James asked, trying to establish normalcy. "Fine," Nathan replied, then hesitated. "Actually, not really fine. Everyone knows what happened. About you and Wilson Construction." James set down his pizza. "I'm sorry you're dealing with the fallout from my mistakes." "Trevor Miller's dad said you embezzled money," Emily blurted out. "I told him that was a lie." "It is a lie," James confirmed gently. "I made serious mistakes, but I didn't steal money." "Then what did you do?" Nathan asked directly. "Mom won't really explain. She just says you betrayed Grandpa Robert's trust." James considered his response carefully. It would be easy to minimize his actions to present himself as a victim of circumstance, but his children deserved the truth, or at least as much of it as they could understand. "I tried to take control of Grandpa Robert's company without his permission," James explained. "I worked with Grandpa Harrison on a plan that would have pushed your grandfather out of the company he built." "Why would you do that?" Emily's young face creased with confusion. "Because I was arrogant and impatient." James admitted the words painful but necessary. "I wanted to run things my way without having to answer to anyone, and I was willing to hurt people to make that happen. Including pushing Grandpa Robert at Christmas." Nathan added, his expression troubled. "Especially that. There's no excuse for what I did. It was wrong, completely wrong." The conversation that followed was unlike any James had ever had with his children. For perhaps the first time he spoke to them, not as an authority figure dispensing wisdom from on high, but as a flawed human being acknowledging his failures. He answered their questions honestly without deflecting responsibility or making excuses. "Are you and Mom getting divorced?" Emily finally asked the question, hanging heavy in the air. "It seems likely," James answered gently. "But that has nothing to do with how much we both love you." "Will we ever live together again as a family?" Her voice was small, vulnerable. "I don't think so, sweetheart." James reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "But we'll always be connected through you and Nathan. That won't change." As the afternoon progressed, James found himself truly listening to his children, perhaps for the first time in years. Nathan spoke about his interest in engineering and his struggle with a particular teacher who seemed determined to undermine his confidence. Emily described her piano recital and her frustration that Sarah had insisted on scaling back her lessons due to the current situation. "Would you like me to speak with your mother about continuing your piano lessons?" James offered. Emily's face brightened. "Could you, Ms. Abernathy says I have real potential. I'll talk to her. Music education is important." When it came time to drive them back to Lake Forest, James felt a curious mixture of sadness and hope. The visit hadn't been perfect, but it had been authentic in a way their previous interactions rarely were. As they pulled up to George Harrison's imposing estate, Sarah emerged from the house, her expression carefully neutral. The children hugged James goodbye, promising to call during the week. "Thank you for bringing them back on time," Sarah said, her voice formal but not unkind. "Sarah, I'd like to discuss continuing Emily's piano lessons," James began. "I know things are tight financially, but..." "James, you're 3 weeks into a job paying $75,000 a year. Your child support calculations are based on that income, not your former salary. How exactly do you propose to fund private music lessons?" The reality check stung, but James persisted. "I'll figure it out. It's important to her." Sarah studied him for a moment. I'll think about it. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't an outright rejection either. James took that as progress. The drive back to his apartment felt longer, the contrast between George Harrison's lakefront estate and his rental in Rogers Park more pronounced. Yet James felt a curious sense of accomplishment. He had connected with his children honestly, without the shield of privilege or authority he had always hidden behind. The following week at Stevenson Builders brought an unexpected challenge. A critical subcontractor on the library project had fallen behind schedule, threatening the entire project timeline. James found himself working 14-hour days, personally visiting fabrication shops, negotiating with suppliers, and reorganizing the construction sequence to accommodate the delays. On Thursday afternoon, as he was reviewing revised schedules with the site foreman, James looked up to see a familiar figure observing from across the construction site. Robert Wilson, dressed in his customary tailored suit, stood watching the activity with an expressionless face. James froze, uncertain how to respond. His father had made no attempt to contact him since the termination had refused all communication. Why was he here now? Before James could decide whether to approach, Robert turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the partially constructed building. The encounter, if it could even be called that, lasted less than 30 seconds. "Everything okay, Mr. Wilson?" the foreman asked, noticing James's distraction. "Yes, fine," James replied automatically, though his mind was racing. Had his father come to check on him, to gloat? Or was it simply coincidence? Robert visiting a nearby project and happening to spot his son. That evening, James called Richard Stevens, hoping for some insight. "Your father doesn't discuss you," Richard said bluntly when James described the sighting. "Not with me, not with anyone at the company." "He was there, Richard, at the library site." "Wilson Construction is bidding on the community center project 2 blocks from your library. Robert's been personally involved in the proposal process." "So it was just coincidence." Richard's sigh was audible. "James, your father is not a man given to coincidences. If he was at your site, he meant to be there." "But why not speak to me?" "What exactly would you want him to say?" The question lingered long after James ended the call. What did he want from his father? Forgiveness seemed too much to ask for. Understanding, recognition of his efforts to rebuild. Or perhaps most fundamentally, acknowledgement that despite everything, they were still father and son. The next morning, James arrived at the construction site earlier than usual, determined to make up for the previous day's distraction. To his surprise, the materials that had been delayed were being unloaded from a truck, the supplier's representative supervising the delivery. "Thought these weren't coming until next week," James said, checking the manifest. "Got a call yesterday afternoon. Priority order from the top." The man shrugged. "Don't ask me why, but someone pulled some strings to move you to the front of the line." James signed for the delivery, a suspicion forming in his mind. Very few people in Chicago had the influence to expedite a materials order with a major supplier during a citywide construction boom. His father was one of them. The delivery solved the immediate scheduling crisis, allowing the project to proceed without further delays. By the end of the day, James had reorganized the work crews to take advantage of the unexpected materials, bringing the project back on schedule. As he was leaving the site, his phone rang. Stanley Stevenson. "Wilson, the client, just called me personally to commend your handling of the schedule issues. Said you showed exceptional problem-solving skills." "Just doing my job, Mr. Stevenson." "Well, keep doing it. They've requested you specifically for Phase 2 of the project." Stevenson's gruff voice softened slightly. "Not bad for 3 weeks on the job." The small victory felt disproportionately significant after months of continuous setbacks. James had managed a crisis effectively, had earned praise based solely on his own efforts rather than his family name or position. It was a modest achievement by objective standards, but it represented something he had rarely experienced in his professional life: genuine earned accomplishment. That weekend, James received an unexpected email from Sarah agreeing to continue Emily's piano lessons on a provisional basis. The financial details were carefully outlined. James would pay the instructor directly, and the lessons would be scheduled during his visitation time to avoid transportation complications. It was a small concession, rigidly structured, but it represented Sarah's first willingness to work with him on any issue since their separation. James accepted immediately, grateful for any progress, however incremental. Sunday evening found James preparing for the upcoming work week, reviewing project timelines and contractor schedules. His modest apartment still felt foreign, the folding table covered with documents instead of fine china, the silence broken only by the occasional sounds of neighbors in the adjacent units. His phone rang. Nathan. Dad, can I ask you something important? Of course, Nathan. Anything. Why hasn't Grandpa Robert contacted us? Emily and I used to see him every week, but since Christmas, nothing. Mom says it's complicated, but I think we deserve to know the truth. James sank into his single comfortable chair, the question hitting him like a physical blow. In his focus on his own relationship with his father, he had somehow overlooked the impact on his children's relationship with their grandfather. Nathan, it's not that he doesn't want to see you, James began carefully. I think he's trying to respect the boundaries your mother has set during this difficult time. Mom hasn't set any boundaries with him. She talks about him all the time, says he and Grandpa Harrison are working together now. The revelation sent a jolt through James. Working together on what? Some big development project. They had dinner here last week. But Grandpa Robert didn't ask about us at all, at least not that I heard. After reassuring Nathan and promising to look into the situation, James ended the call, his mind racing with implications. Robert and George, formerly competitors, were now collaborating professionally. Yet Robert had made no attempt to maintain his relationship with his grandchildren, despite the close bond they had always shared. It didn't make sense unless Robert believed that James had turned his children against him. Or worse, unless Sarah or George had somehow given that impression. The possibility was troubling enough that James broke his self-imposed rule against initiating contact with Robert. He composed a brief email focusing solely on Nathan and Emily's desire to see their grandfather, explicitly stating that regardless of the situation between father and son, the grandchildren should not be collateral damage. He didn't expect a response and none came. But 3 days later, Nathan called, his voice excited. Dad, Grandpa Robert called me. He wants to take me and Emily for ice cream this weekend. Is that okay with you? Relief washed over James. Of course it's okay. That's wonderful, Nathan. He said he's been busy with work, but he misses us, and he asked about you. James's heart skipped a beat. What did he ask? Just how you were doing, if you seemed okay. I told him about your new apartment and your job at Stevenson Builders. And what did he say? Nothing really. Just nodded and changed the subject. Nathan paused. Do you think you guys will ever talk again? I don't know, son. That's up to your grandfather. The knowledge that Robert had reached out to his grandchildren brought James a measure of peace. Whatever his father's feelings toward him, Robert wasn't extending that estrangement to Nathan and Emily. It was one less burden for James to carry in the complex emotional landscape he now navigated daily. As spring turned to early summer, James settled into a rhythm at Stevenson Builders. The library project progressed on schedule, his working relationships with colleagues gradually warming from cool professionalism to cautious respect. Stanley Stevenson had even invited him to participate in project development meetings, a sign of growing trust. James's personal life had found a tentative equilibrium as well. The divorce proceedings continued, but with less acrimony than initially feared. Sarah had agreed to a visitation schedule that allowed James to see the children every other weekend and one evening per week. His modest salary covered child support and his basic living expenses, with little left over, but enough to maintain his independence. On a warm June evening, James was working late at the construction site, reviewing final electrical installations before a critical inspection the following day. The building was empty, save for security, the usual noise of construction replaced by an almost reverent silence. He became aware of footsteps approaching from behind, echoing in the cavernous space. Turning, James found himself face to face with his father for the first time since January. Robert Wilson had aged in the intervening months. Though still imposingly tall and distinguished, new lines etched his face and the silver at his temples had spread throughout his hair. He stood with hands clasped behind his back, surveying the nearly completed library with an expert's eye. The mezzanine lighting is elegant, Robert said, his voice neutral. Good sight lines from the reference desk. James stood frozen, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected appearance and even more unexpected commentary. The children tell me you're managing this project. Robert continued, moving further into the space, examining details with professional interest. Stevenson has a solid reputation, conservative but reliable. Dad, Why are you here? Robert turned to face his son directly, his expression unreadable. The community center project next door. We won the bid. Congratulations. It wasn't a competition, James. Stevenson Builders didn't bid on that project. I meant it sincerely. Robert nodded slowly, accepting the statement. He moved to examine the circulation desk, running his hand along the polished wood surface. Nathan says you're taking them to the Cubs game this weekend. Yes, Emily's first baseball game. She'll hate the noise but pretend to enjoy it for your sake, Robert observed with unexpected insight. She's always been like that, eager to please. The casual observation about his granddaughter, delivered with such certainty and affection, caught James off guard. It was a reminder of how well Robert knew the children, how closely he had observed their developing personalities over the years. Dad, I'm not here for apologies, James. Robert's voice remained level, without anger, but also without warmth. What happened happened. We both need to live with the consequences. Then why are you here? Robert looked around the library once more, then back at his son. To see for myself. See what? If what Nathan and Richard have been telling me is accurate, that you're rebuilding your life, taking responsibility, doing honest work. James swallowed emotion threatening to overwhelm him. And what's your assessment? Robert gestured to the construction site around them. This is good work, solid craftsmanship, attention to detail. He paused. It speaks well of you that you've applied yourself here despite the adjustment in circumstances. It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement, professional respect from one builder to another. For James, it felt like the first ray of light after months of darkness. Thank you, he said simply, not wanting to overreach. Robert nodded once, then turned to leave. At the doorway, he paused. The children mentioned you're teaching Nathan to drive. Use the empty section of the Northwestern campus parking lot on weekends. It's where I taught you. Plenty of space for mistakes. With that, he was gone, leaving James standing amid sawdust and scaffolding, processing the brief but significant encounter. His father had sought him out, had observed his work, had offered practical advice about teaching Nathan to drive. Small gestures perhaps, but meaningful ones. For the first time since Christmas Eve, James allowed himself to consider the possibility that while some bridges had been irreparably burned, others might someday be carefully, painstakingly rebuilt. That night, in his modest apartment with its folding table and secondhand furniture, James Wilson slept more peacefully than he had in 6 months. The path forward remained uncertain, the consequences of his actions still unfolding. But he had glimpsed something today that had previously seemed impossible, the potential for redemption, not through grand gestures or dramatic apologies, but through the quiet dignity of honest work and genuine change. Perhaps that in the end was what his father had been trying to teach him all along. Autumn painted Chicago in brilliant hues of amber and crimson. The city's skyscrapers gleamed against clear blue skies as temperatures cooled and leaves transformed. For James Wilson, this season marked 9 months since his world had collapsed. Enough time for reflection, adaptation, and the tentative beginnings of rebuilding. The West Side Library project had been completed 2 weeks ahead of schedule and marginally under budget, earning Stevenson Builders a performance bonus and cementing James's position within the company. What had begun as an entry-level opportunity born of desperation had evolved into something resembling a genuine career path. Stanley Stevenson had assigned him to increasingly complex projects, most recently naming him lead project manager for a $12 million medical center development. James's personal life had stabilized into a new normal. The divorce was finalized in August with terms less punitive than he had initially feared. Sarah retained primary custody of the children, but James secured meaningful visitation rights, every other weekend plus Wednesday evenings. His modest 2-bedroom apartment in Rogers Park now featured actual furniture instead of folding tables, though nothing approaching the luxury he had once taken for granted. On this particular Thursday evening, James sat at his kitchen counter reviewing cost estimates for the medical center project. His phone buzzed with a text message from Nathan. "Dad, can I stay with you this weekend instead of going to the homecoming dance? Need to talk about something important." The request was unusual. Nathan typically thrived in social situations, particularly school events. James replied immediately, "Of course. Everything okay? Just need some advice, from you specifically." James stared at the message, a mixture of concern and quiet satisfaction warming his chest. After everything that had happened, his 15-year-old son was turning to him for guidance. It represented a kind of trust he had feared permanently lost. "You can always talk to me. Pick you up Friday after school as usual." "Thanks, Dad." James returned to his work, but his mind kept drifting to the possible reasons behind Nathan's request. Academic problems seemed unlikely, given his consistently strong performance. Social issues. Girl troubles. Whatever it was, James felt a responsibility to provide the kind of thoughtful support he had rarely offered when material provisions had been his primary focus as a father. Friday afternoon found James waiting outside Lake Forest Academy in his used Honda Accord, a reliable but decidedly unglamorous replacement for the luxury vehicles that had once defined his self-image. Nathan emerged from the building with a serious expression, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "No Emily today?" James asked as his son settled into the passenger seat. "Mom's taking her to ballet and then a sleepover." Nathan stared out the window. "Emily's thriving. Mom's got her in all these activities." James nodded, detecting an undercurrent of something in his son's voice. "And how about you keeping busy?" Nathan shrugged. "Mostly with schoolwork. AP Physics is kicking my butt." They drove in companionable silence for a while, James resisting the urge to press for details about the important matter Nathan wanted to discuss. Experience had taught him that teenagers operated on their own timetable when it came to difficult conversations. After stopping for takeout from a Thai restaurant Nathan particularly enjoyed, they arrived at James's apartment. The space had evolved over the months. Bookshelves now lined one wall filled with engineering and architecture volumes James had salvaged from storage. Photos of Nathan and Emily occupied prominent positions on side tables. It wasn't luxurious, but it felt increasingly like home. They settled at the small dining table with their food, making casual conversation about school and James's current project. Only after they'd finished eating did Nathan finally broach the subject that had been weighing on his mind. "Dad, I need to ask you something about Grandpa Robert." James set down his water glass carefully. "What about him?" "He's been spending a lot of time with us lately, coming over for dinner at Grandpa Harrison's house, taking me to engineering exhibits, bringing Emily to piano recitals." Nathan hesitated. "It's nice, but weird. Like suddenly he's super involved." "Your grandfather loves you both very much," James replied cautiously. "He's probably trying to make up for lost time." "That's the thing." Nathan leaned forward. "Last week he and Grandpa Harrison were talking in the study. They didn't know I could hear them. Grandpa Harrison said something about moving forward with the next phase now that the integration is complete." James felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation that had accompanied every business discussion with George Harrison. "Did you hear anything else?" "Grandpa Robert said he needed to discuss something with Mom first, something about custodial considerations. Then they saw me and stopped talking." Nathan's expression grew troubled. "Dad, what's going on? Are they trying to, I don't know, cut you out completely?" The question hung in the air, laden with implications James had been too focused on his own recovery to consider. George Harrison had always been calculating, strategic in his business and personal dealings. And while Robert had reached a tentative détente with James in recent months, their relationship remained profoundly damaged. "Nathan, I don't think your grandfather would ever try to come between us," James said carefully. "Whatever business arrangements he and George have made, they're separate from family matters." "But what if they're not?" Nathan pressed. "Mom talks about Grandpa Robert differently now, like he's some kind of hero and you're—" He trailed off. "The villain," James supplied gently. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." James took a deep breath. "Nathan, I made serious mistakes. Your grandfather had every right to be angry with me to protect what he built. If he and George have found common ground professionally, that could be a good thing for everyone. But what does that have to do with custodial considerations?" James had no answer that wouldn't alarm his son further. Instead, he redirected. "Have you asked your grandfather about it directly?" Nathan shook his head. "It feels like I'd be betraying Mom somehow, or you, or, I don't know. Everyone's acting like everything's fine, but it's not fine. It's weird and tense, and nobody talks about what really happened." In that moment, James recognized that his son wasn't just seeking information. He was struggling to navigate divided loyalties in a fractured family landscape. a landscape James himself had created through his actions on Christmas Eve. Nathan, the situation between the adults in this family is complicated, James acknowledged. But one thing is absolutely clear: you and Emily are loved. By your mother, by both your grandfathers, and especially by me. You don't have to choose sides or carry our burdens. But I feel like I'm being used somehow, like a chess piece everyone's moving around. The insight was startlingly mature and painfully accurate. James felt a surge of pride in his son's perception, coupled with shame that he had contributed to creating such a situation. "I promise you I will never use you as leverage or put you in the middle," James said firmly. "And if you ever feel that's happening with anyone else, you can tell me. We'll figure it out together." Later that night, after Nathan had gone to bed in the small second bedroom, James sat in the darkness contemplating their conversation. The phrase custodial considerations nagged at him, conjuring scenarios ranging from innocent to alarming. Was Robert simply ensuring his continued access to his grandchildren, or was something more calculated underway, perhaps a legal strategy developed with George's influence? The next morning, James made a decision. While Nathan slept in, he placed a call to his attorney, Marcus Bennett, not the high-powered firm that had initially represented him in the divorce, but a straightforward family lawyer he could now actually afford. "James, what can I do for you?" Marcus answered, the sounds of a Saturday morning youth soccer game audible in the background. "I need some information about post-divorce custody modifications," James explained, keeping his voice low. "Specifically, what would be required legally for my ex-wife to further restrict my visitation rights." "That's a high bar, especially when the divorce is recent," Marcus replied. "Courts generally need to see material changes in circumstances, evidence of endangerment, neglect, new addiction issues, that sort of thing." "Why has Sarah indicated she's pursuing modifications?" "Not directly, but I've heard concerning conversations between her father and mine about custodial considerations." Marcus was silent for a moment. "That could mean anything, James. But if you're worried, document everything. Every visit, every interaction with the kids, every payment. Create a paper trail of responsible parenting." After the call ended, James began a methodical review of his parental responsibilities. Child support payments were current and documented. Visitation had been consistent without cancellations. The children's academic and extracurricular activities were supported both financially and through his personal involvement. By objective measures, James had been fulfilling his obligations impeccably since the divorce. Yet the conversation Nathan had overheard suggested something was in motion behind the scenes, something involving both Robert and George in decisions that would affect James's relationship with his children. When Nathan woke, James suggested they spend the day at the Museum of Science and Industry, a favorite destination since Nathan's earliest childhood. As they explored exhibits on architecture and engineering, James observed his son's genuine enthusiasm, his insightful questions, his growing intellectual confidence. "You know," James remarked as they examined a display on sustainable building materials, "you remind me of your grandfather sometimes. He has that same ability to see how structures fit together, how materials interact." Nathan glanced up surprised. "Really? Grandpa says the same thing about me." "He does. Yeah, he says I've got the Wilson eye for construction. He's been sending me articles about engineering programs at different universities." Nathan hesitated. "Is that okay? I wasn't sure if it would bother you." "Why would it bother me?" "Because of everything that happened, with you and him and the company." James placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Nathan, I would be thrilled if you developed an interest in engineering or construction, and your grandfather has decades of wisdom to share. That's your birthright, regardless of my mistakes." The genuine smile that spread across Nathan's face was worth more than any luxury James had surrendered in his fall from grace. Sunday afternoon came too quickly, bringing the time to return Nathan to Lake Forest. As they pulled up to the Harrison estate, James noticed both Robert's and George's cars in the circular driveway, another Sunday dinner gathering from which he remained excluded. "Thanks for listening, Dad," Nathan said as he gathered his backpack. "It helped talking about this stuff." "Anytime, son. I mean that literally. Day or night if you need me, call." Nathan nodded, then surprised James with a quick, fierce hug before jogging up the steps to the imposing front door. James waited until his son was safely inside before driving away, troubled thoughts swirling despite the otherwise pleasant weekend. The following Wednesday, James received an unexpected email from his father. The message was brief and businesslike. Need to discuss a matter regarding the children. Available to meet Thursday 7 p.m. at Carson's Steakhouse downtown if convenient for you. James stared at the screen, reading and rereading the terse message. In 9 months, this was the first direct communication from his father that wasn't related to legal documents or company matters. Whatever prompted it, it clearly involved Nathan and Emily, reason enough for James to accept immediately. Carson's Steakhouse was neutral territory, neither a Wilson construction haunt nor one of James's former social clubs, but a respected Chicago institution known for privacy and discretion. James arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in his best non-luxury business attire, determined to present himself as composed and responsible despite his inner apprehension. Robert arrived precisely at 7, wearing the same charcoal gray suit he had favored for important meetings throughout James's childhood. At 68, he remained an imposing figure, his posture unbent by age or circumstance. The maitre d' led them to a quiet corner booth where Robert ordered a neat scotch while James requested water. "Thank you for coming," Robert began once they were alone. "I thought it best to speak directly about certain developments." "Concerning the children," James prompted. "Yes." Robert took a measured sip of his scotch. "I've been spending considerable time with Nathan and Emily over the past few months, getting to know them again in a sense. They've mentioned that. They enjoy your company. They're exceptional young people, far more perceptive than perhaps we've given them credit for." James nodded, waiting for his father to reach the actual purpose of this unprecedented meeting. "Nathan came to me yesterday with concerns," Robert continued, his expression grave. "He believes there's some sort of conspiracy between George and myself regarding custody arrangements." James carefully maintained a neutral expression. "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that no such conspiracy exists." Robert placed his glass on the table deliberately. "But his concern raised a legitimate issue that needs addressing, which is, the children are caught in the crossfire of adult animosities they didn't create and don't deserve." Robert's gaze was direct, unflinching. "George Harrison and I have indeed developed a professional relationship. Wilson Construction and Harrison Properties are collaborating on the River North Development Project, a partnership that will benefit both companies significantly." "Congratulations," James said, meaning it despite the complex emotions the news evoked. "This business relationship has necessarily brought me into more frequent contact with Sarah and by extension the children. But George has recently begun making suggestions regarding your parental rights that I find troubling." James tensed. "What kind of suggestions?" "He believes Sarah should seek primary legal custody in addition to physical custody, effectively minimizing your decision-making authority regarding the children's education, religious upbringing, and other significant matters." "On what grounds?" "Ostensibly, your financial instability and demonstrated poor judgment." Robert's tone made clear his opinion of these justifications. "In reality, I believe George sees the children as extensions of his dynasty. He's always been preoccupied with legacy." James processed this information carefully. "And where do you stand on this, Dad?" The question hung between them, laden with implications that went far beyond the immediate custody issue. It was in many ways the first test of whatever tentative rebuilding might be possible between father and son. "I stand with my grandchildren's best interests," Robert replied firmly. "And those interests include having their father actively involved in their lives. Whatever transpired between us, James, you're a good father. You always have been. And you've demonstrated remarkable resilience and character these past 9 months." The unexpected validation momentarily robbed James of speech. He had come prepared for accusations, legal threats, perhaps even a further severing of ties. Instead, his father was effectively declaring himself an ally in maintaining James's relationship with his children. "Thank you," he finally managed. "That means more than I can express." Robert waved away the gratitude. "This isn't sentiment, James. It's pragmatism. Children need both parents whenever possible, especially teenagers navigating critical developmental stages." "Have you expressed this opinion to George?" "Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first to ensure we present a united front on this specific issue, regardless of our other differences." "A united front." James repeated the phrase, feeling foreign after so many months of opposition. "What exactly are you proposing?" "That we meet with Sarah together, not George, just Sarah. present a clear, rational case for maintaining the current custody arrangement. She values stability for the children and generally makes decisions independent of her father's influence when given space to do so. James considered the suggestion. Sarah might view this as us ganging up on her. Perhaps, Robert acknowledged. But she also respects straightforward approaches. No manipulation, no hidden agendas, just honest concern for Nathan and Emily. As their stakes arrived, the conversation shifted to practical matters, scheduling the proposed meeting, anticipating Sarah's concerns, identifying neutral mediators if necessary. Throughout the meal, James noted subtle changes in his father's demeanor. Robert remained formal, certainly, but the cold rage that had defined their few interactions since Christmas had dissipated, replaced by a cautious professionalism. Nathan mentioned you've been discussing engineering programs with him, James said as they waited for coffee. The boy has natural aptitude. Reminds me of you at that age before you decided business administration was more prestigious than structural engineering. The observation carried no judgment, just matter-of-fact recognition of a path not taken. James had indeed changed his college major from engineering to business partly to impress his father, an irony that hadn't occurred to him until this moment. He might be the engineer neither of us became, James suggested. Perhaps. Something almost resembling a smile touched Robert's lips. He's certainly asking better questions than most first-year engineering students I've encountered. When the check arrived, Robert reached for it automatically, then paused, glancing at James. A silent acknowledgement passed between them, recognition that their financial situations had shifted dramatically, that old patterns of paternal provision no longer applied. I invited you, Robert said, simply placing his credit card on the tray. Outside the restaurant, standing in the crisp October evening, an awkward moment ensued as they prepared to part ways. Neither man moved to embrace the other or even shake hands, the breach between them still too raw for such gestures. I'll contact Sarah tomorrow, Robert said. How's your schedule next week? Flexible after 5 most days. The medical center project is in the foundation phase. Stevenson mentioned you're handling that. Significant responsibility. I'm learning a lot, James acknowledged. Different perspective from the executive suite. Robert nodded. Sometimes the best view of a building comes from the ground up, not the top down. He paused. Good night, James. Good night, Dad. Driving home, James felt an unfamiliar lightness. The meeting hadn't represented forgiveness or reconciliation. Those concepts remained distant possibilities at best. But it had established something arguably more important, a functional relationship based on their shared commitment to Nathan and Emily. It was a beginning, perhaps the only one possible under the circumstances. The following Tuesday evening, James, Robert, and Sarah gathered in the neutral setting of a mediator's office in downtown Chicago. The meeting had been arranged through Sarah's attorney, with all parties agreeing to a non-adversarial discussion about the children's needs. Sarah appeared surprised to see James and Robert arrive together, her carefully composed expression momentarily revealing confusion. Dressed in a tailored navy suit that projected both authority and femininity, she had clearly come prepared for confrontation rather than collaboration. Thank you both for agreeing to this discussion. The mediator began, a seasoned family counselor named Dr. Abrams. I understand we're here to address concerns about the current custody arrangements for Nathan and Emily Wilson. Sarah spoke first, her voice controlled but edged with tension. I want to clarify that I haven't filed any motions to modify the existing custody agreement. This meeting was suggested rather insistently by Robert. Because Nathan and Emily have expressed anxiety about potential changes, Robert replied evenly. Children are remarkably perceptive, Sarah. They sense when adults are considering decisions that affect them, even when we believe we're being discreet. My father may have made some overzealous comments, Sarah acknowledged with visible reluctance, but I make my own decisions regarding my children. Our children, James corrected gently. Sarah's gaze shifted to him, assessing. In the months since their divorce, their interactions had been limited to logistics regarding visitation and child support. This was the first time they had engaged in a substantive discussion about co-parenting philosophies. James has been consistent and responsible in his parenting since the separation, she conceded after a moment. The children look forward to their time with him. Then I'm confused about why George would suggest seeking primary legal custody, Robert interjected. My father is protective, Sarah said, a defensive note entering her voice. He wants security for the children. The children already have security, James pointed out. Financial, emotional, educational, Between all of us, Nathan and Emily's needs are being met exceptionally well. But there's still the matter of stability, Sarah countered. James's living situation, his career changed the significant reduction in his income, all of which have stabilized, Robert said before James could respond. James has established himself at Stevenson Builders, secured appropriate housing, and maintained all financial obligations to the children. By objective measures, he's demonstrated remarkable adaptation to drastically changed circumstances. Sarah seemed taken aback by Robert's defense of his son. I wasn't expecting you to advocate for James given everything that happened. I'm advocating for my grandchildren, Robert clarified, and they benefit from having a meaningful relationship with their father regardless of the history between James and myself. Dr. Abrams guided the discussion skillfully, helping all three adults articulate their concerns and priorities regarding the children. As the conversation progressed, a surprising consensus emerged. Despite the acrimony of the divorce, despite the dramatic fall from privilege, James had experienced all three adults genuinely prioritize Nathan and Emily's well-being. What I'm hearing, Dr. Abrams summarized, is that none of you actually wants to change the current custody arrangement. The anxiety seems to stem from external suggestions and misunderstandings rather than dissatisfaction with the status quo. Sarah nodded slowly. That's fair. I have no immediate plans to seek modification. The current arrangement is working and the children are adjusting well. Then perhaps what's needed is simply better communication, the mediator suggested. Regular check-ins between the three of you regarding the children's needs without intermediaries who may have their own agendas. That seems reasonable, Robert agreed. I'd welcome that, James added. Sarah studied both men thoughtfully. We would need to establish boundaries, clear separation between business matters and family discussions. Absolutely, Robert said. George and I can manage our business partnership without involving custody considerations. As the meeting concluded, a tentative framework had been established. Quarterly meetings to discuss the children's academic progress, emotional well-being, and future planning with more frequent communication as needed for specific issues. It wasn't perfect, but it represented a significant improvement over the fragmented, suspicious communication that had characterized the past 9 months. Outside the mediator's office, an awkward moment ensued as the three adults prepared to depart. Sarah hesitated, then addressed James directly. Emily's winter piano recital is next month. She's been practicing Debussy's Clair de Lune. It's quite advanced for her age. I know. She plays it for me during our Wednesday visits, James replied. Her technique has improved remarkably. Sarah seemed surprised. You still play with her? Every week. We take turns. She plays her recital pieces. I play something from memory, usually badly. James smiled at the recollection. It's our thing. Something softened in Sarah's expression. Not warmth exactly, but a recognition of James's genuine involvement in their daughter's life. The recital is November 12th. Emily would want you there. I wouldn't miss it. The invitation, small as it was, represented a significant shift. For the first time since the separation, Sarah had voluntarily included James in a family event beyond his mandated visitation. As Sarah departed, Robert lingered briefly. That went better than expected. Yes, James agreed. Thank you for initiating it. Robert nodded. The River North Project groundbreaking ceremony is next week. Harrison Properties and Wilson Construction official partners. He paused. George will be there, obviously. It might be awkward. I understand, James said, assuming he was being warned to stay away. Nathan asked if he could attend. Educational opportunity, he called it. Robert's expression remained neutral. I told him yes, but that I'd need to check with his parents. Both of them. The implication was clear. Robert was inviting James to the groundbreaking, a public acknowledgement of their relationship despite the professional severing. It was a small gesture, but significant. Another step in the long, uncertain process of rebuilding. I think that would be an excellent educational opportunity for Nathan, James replied carefully. If Sarah agrees, I'd be happy to bring him. Good. Robert turned to leave, then paused. The project uses an innovative foundation system developed by our engineering department. Nathan might find it interesting. I'm sure he will. The groundbreaking ceremony took place on a crisp November morning with city officials, business leaders, and local press in attendance. James and Nathan stood among the crowd watching as Robert and George ceremonially turned the first shovelful of earth on what would become a 20-acre mixed-use development along the Chicago River. That's going to be your grandfather's biggest project yet, James told Nathan as they observed the proceedings. Both my grandfathers, Nathan corrected. Grandpa Harrison keeps calling it his legacy project. James nodded, watching as Robert and George posed for photographs. Their business relationship apparently seamless despite the complicated family dynamics that connected them. The irony wasn't lost on him. His failed attempt to force a merger between the two companies had ultimately led to a legitimate partnership, just not one that included him. After the formal ceremony concluded, attendees mingled at a reception under a large heated tent. James hesitated at the periphery, uncertain of his place in this gathering of business and civic leaders, many of whom had witnessed his professional downfall. "Dad, Grandpa's waving us over," Nathan said, pointing toward Robert, who stood conversing with several men in suits. As they approached, Robert extended his hand to James, a public gesture that didn't go unnoticed by those nearby. "James, I'd like you to meet the project's lead structural engineer, Dr. Patel." The introduction was delivered naturally without explanation or apology for James's presence. It was in its way a declaration, whatever their private history. Robert was acknowledging James as family in this public setting. "And this is my grandson, Nathan," Robert continued, placing a hand on the teenager's shoulder. "He's showing remarkable aptitude for engineering principles." Dr. Patel engaged Nathan in conversation about the foundation system, clearly impressed by the young man's insightful questions. As they chatted, Robert drew James slightly aside. "George isn't pleased you're here," he said quietly. "He made his objections known rather forcefully this morning." "I can leave if it's causing problems," James offered. "No, this is a Wilson construction project as much as a Harrison Properties development, and you're a Wilson." Robert's expression remained professionally neutral, but his words carried undeniable significance. "Besides, Nathan wanted you here. That takes precedence over George's discomfort." Across the tent, George Harrison observed them with barely concealed displeasure, his usual polished demeanor strained by the unexpected complication of James's presence at what should have been his moment of triumph. "Sarah agreed to our attending," James noted. "That couldn't have been easy for her to explain to her father." "Sarah is demonstrating admirable independence," Robert replied. "She's beginning to recognize that her father's agenda doesn't always align with the children's best interests." The remainder of the event passed without incident, though James was acutely aware of curious glances and whispered comments from former colleagues and business associates. Most were too professional to approach directly, but their surprise at seeing him in Robert's company was evident. As they prepared to leave, Nathan pulled out his phone to show James several photos he'd taken of the architectural renderings displayed throughout the tent. "This is going to be amazing when it's finished. Grandpa says it'll take almost 3 years to complete all phases." "Your grandfather builds for the long term," James said. "Always has. He says you're doing that too now, building something new just at a different scale." James glanced at his father, who was engaged in conversation several yards away. "Did he actually say that?" "Yeah, when I asked him if you would ever work at Wilson Construction again." Nathan looked up from his phone. "He said you were rebuilding your life from the foundation up, and that's harder and more important than any construction project." The insight caught James off guard. Not just the fact that Robert had spoken of him in such terms to Nathan, but the accuracy of the metaphor. He had indeed been rebuilding from the foundation up, financially, professionally, emotionally, creating a structure more modest, but perhaps ultimately more sound than what had existed before. In the car driving home, Nathan was uncharacteristically quiet, staring out the window at the Chicago skyline. "Everything okay?" James asked. "You seem to enjoy the event." "I did." Nathan turned to face his father. "Dad, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you miss it?" "The money, the big house, being CEO. All of it." James considered the question carefully. "I miss certain aspects. The security, obviously. The ability to provide whatever you and Emily needed without hesitation." He paused. "But other parts, the constant pressure, the focus on appearances, the politics, I don't miss those at all." "Are you happier now?" The question was startlingly direct, forcing James to confront realities he had been avoiding. "Not happier exactly, but maybe more authentic. I'm doing honest work. I'm earning respect based on actual skills, not my last name. I'm learning who I really am without all the trappings of success." Nathan nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. I think you're better now. Better? As a dad, you listen more. You're more present, I guess. The simple observation struck James profoundly. In his former life, he had provided abundantly for his children's material needs, while frequently being absent emotionally, distracted by business concerns, social obligations, the endless pursuit of greater success. Now, with fewer resources but more self-awareness, he was apparently giving his children something more valuable, his genuine attention. "Thank you for telling me that," James said quietly. "It means a lot." The winter weeks passed with increasing momentum. James's work at Stevenson Builders expanded to include preliminary design consultations as well as project management, recognition of his growing value to the firm. His financial situation, while still modest compared to his former wealth, had stabilized into sustainable comfort. Most importantly, his relationships with Nathan and Emily continued to deepen each visit, revealing new dimensions of his children's developing personalities. Emily's piano recital in mid-November proved particularly meaningful. James arrived early, taking a seat near the middle of the auditorium, careful not to intrude on the front row position Sarah traditionally occupied at these events. To his surprise, Robert appeared just before the program began, nodding briefly to James before taking a seat several rows ahead. When Emily took the stage, her poise was remarkable for a 12-year-old. She acknowledged the audience with a graceful bow, then seated herself at the grand piano. Her performance of Claire de Lune was technically imperfect but emotionally compelling, a reflection of her developing artistic sensibility. Afterward, at the reception, Emily moved between her three parents, biological and step, with the diplomatic skill of a seasoned ambassador, ensuring each adult received appropriate attention. James noticed Robert observing this dance with something approaching amusement. "She navigates complex social dynamics better than most executives I've known," Robert commented when James joined him at the refreshment table. "Emily's always been perceptive about people," James agreed. "Even as a toddler, she could read a room instantly. A valuable skill in any field." Robert accepted a cup of punch from a volunteer. Sarah mentioned Emily's interested in architecture now, not just music. "She's been sketching house designs lately. Nothing technical, but she has a good eye for proportion." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "Wilson Construction has a summer internship program for high school students. Mostly administrative work, but with exposure to all departments. Might be worth considering when she's a bit older." The casual suggestion that Emily might someday intern at the company James had been exiled from carried implications James wasn't quite ready to process. Instead, he simply nodded. She'd probably enjoy that. As December approached, bringing with it the inevitable associations with Christmas, James found himself increasingly reflective. The year had transformed him in ways he was still discovering, stripping away layers of entitlement and self-importance to reveal capabilities and character strengths he hadn't known he possessed. The first anniversary of his fall from grace loomed like a shadow on the calendar. December 24th, a date that had forever altered the trajectory of his life. James had no plans for Christmas Eve, having arranged to see the children on Christmas Day instead. The prospect of spending the anniversary alone in his apartment held little appeal, but neither did any of the alternatives that came to mind. 2 weeks before Christmas, James received an unexpected call from Richard Stevens, his father's longtime colleague, who had briefly served as interim CEO of Wilson Construction. "James, how are you?" Richard's voice carried its usual straightforward warmth. "Doing well, all things considered. How's life at the executive level?" "Busy. The River North project is consuming everyone's attention." Richard paused. "That's actually why I'm calling. We're holding our annual holiday party next Friday. Your father asked me to extend an invitation." James nearly dropped the phone. "To Wilson Construction's holiday party, is he serious?" "Completely. He was quite clear that you should be included on the guest list." "Richard, half the executive team witnessed my very public termination. The other half has spent the past year cleaning up the mess I created. Why would my father want me there?" "You'd have to ask him that," Richard replied. "All I know is he was insistent, and Robert Wilson doesn't do anything without purpose." After ending the call, James sat in his living room contemplating the implications of the invitation. It could be an olive branch, a public acknowledgement of their tentative reconciliation. It could also be a test of his humility, his ability to face former colleagues with dignity, his willingness to accept a radically changed status. He called Nathan for perspective, explaining the situation and his reservations. "You should definitely go," his son said without hesitation. "Grandpa wouldn't have invited you if he didn't want you there." "It's going to be uncomfortable, Nathan. These people were my colleagues, in some cases my subordinates. Now well, I'm not sure what they are." "They're the people who work with your dad," Nathan said simply. "And you're his son. That hasn't changed no matter what else happened." The wisdom in the observation struck James forcefully. Despite everything, the betrayal, the attempted takeover, the public humiliation on both sides, the fundamental relationship remained. Robert was his father. James was his son. That biological reality persisted beneath the complex layers of professional and personal conflict. "When did you get so insightful?" James asked his son. "Probably around the time my whole family imploded," Nathan replied with typical teenage directness. "Makes you pay attention to what really matters." The Wilson Construction holiday party was held at the Chicago Yacht Club, a venue that evoked memories of countless corporate functions from James's previous life. He arrived precisely on time, dressed in his best suit, not the bespoke luxury of his CEO days, but a well-tailored conservative selection that projected dignified professionalism. The security guard at the entrance checked his ID against the guest list, doing a double take when he realized who James was. "Mr. Wilson, welcome back, sir." "Thank you, Carl. Good to see you again." Inside the ballroom was elegantly decorated with tasteful holiday arrangements, nothing ostentatious, in keeping with Robert's preference for understated quality. A string quartet played classical arrangements of seasonal music, providing a sophisticated backdrop to the mingling executives and their guests. James paused just inside the entrance, surveying the room. He recognized most faces: long-standing employees, board members, significant clients. Several people noticed his arrival, conversations momentarily pausing as awareness of his presence spread through the gathering. Before awkwardness could solidify, Richard appeared at his side. "James, good to see you. Come, your father's over by the windows with the mayor." The simple act of being escorted through the room by a senior executive sent a clear message to everyone observing. James Wilson's presence was officially sanctioned. While this didn't eliminate the curious glances or whispered comments, it provided a context for his unexpected appearance. Robert stood conversing with Chicago's mayor and several prominent business leaders, his commanding presence undiminished by age. When he spotted James approaching, he offered a brief nod of acknowledgement. "Mayor Williams, I believe you know my son, James." "Of course. Good to see you, James. I understand you're with Stevenson Builders now. They did excellent work on the West Side Library." "Yes, that was one of my projects, actually." "Impressive work. I was particularly pleased with the community engagement elements." The conversation proceeded naturally, with no reference to James's dramatic departure from Wilson Construction or the events that precipitated it. Robert's introduction had seamlessly established a tone of normalcy that others in the group followed, discussing current projects, civic developments, and industry trends. As the evening progressed, James navigated a complex social landscape. Some former colleagues approached with genuine warmth. Others maintained polite distance. No one directly mentioned the elephant in the room, the Christmas Eve incident, the attempted takeover, James's subsequent fall from privilege. But awareness of that history colored every interaction. Linda Chen, the CFO who had helped Robert uncover James's financial manipulations, surprised him by offering a direct handshake and meeting his gaze evenly. "You're doing good work at Stevenson. Stanley speaks highly of your project management skills." "Thank you, Linda. That means a lot coming from you." She studied him for a moment. "You seem different, more grounded." "Losing everything will do that," James acknowledged with a rueful smile. "Not everything," she corrected, glancing toward Robert, who stood across the room in conversation with board members. "Some things can't be lost, only damaged and repaired." The observation lingered with James as he continued circulating through the party. He was no longer the heir apparent, the golden son destined to inherit the Wilson empire. That future had been irrevocably altered by his own actions. Yet his presence here, invited by Robert himself, suggested possibilities for a different kind of relationship, one built not on succession and inheritance, but on mutual respect and gradual reconciliation. Near the end of the evening, as guests began departing, James found himself momentarily alone at the windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Robert approached quietly, 2 glasses of scotch in hand. He offered one to James, who accepted with a nod of thanks. "You handled yourself well tonight. Robert observed his gaze directed outward toward the dark waters. Can't have been easy. Easier than I expected, James admitted. People were remarkably civil. They respect the invitation, and they've observed your efforts this past year. Robert sipped his scotch. Resilience earns a certain regard even from former adversaries. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the awkwardness that had characterized their recent interactions notably diminished. Thank you for including me tonight, James finally said. It means more than I can adequately express. Robert nodded once, acknowledging the sentiment without requiring further elaboration. Christmas Eve is next week. Yes. The date hung between them, laden with shared memory. Sarah's hosting dinner at her new lakeshore apartment, for the children primarily, but also as a gesture of continuity, I suppose. She's invited me. Robert turned to face his son directly. She mentioned she extended an invitation to you as well. She did. I haven't responded yet. Because of last year. Partly. And partly because I wasn't sure if my presence would make things uncomfortable for everyone else, including you. Robert considered this. The past year has brought significant changes for all of us. Some losses, some unexpected gains. He placed his empty glass on a nearby table. I think Nathan and Emily would appreciate having their family together for Christmas Eve, complicated as that family has become. Even with George and Sarah's new boyfriend in attendance. Even so. A ghost of a smile touched Robert's lips. George is finding Stephen's presence nearly as uncomfortable as he might find yours. The man is an art historian with decidedly progressive political views. The observation, delivered with dry humor, represented perhaps the first moment of genuine levity between father and son in over a year. James couldn't help but smile at the image of George Harrison's stalwart conservative and ruthless businessman attempting to make conversation with an academic from Sarah's new social circle. In that case, I'll accept Sarah's invitation, James decided, for the children's sake. For all our sakes, Robert amended quietly. Christmas Eve arrived with gentle snowfall, transforming Chicago into a scene from a holiday card. James stood before the mirror in his apartment, adjusting his tie and rehearsing potential conversation topics that would avoid sensitive subjects. The prospect of returning to the scene of last year's catastrophe filled him with apprehension, yet also a cautious hope that this gathering might represent a new beginning. He had purchased modest but thoughtful gifts for Nathan and Emily, books related to their current interests, gift cards for experiences they could share. For Sarah, a simple but elegant scarf he remembered her admiring years earlier. For Stephen, a well-reviewed biography of Michelangelo, selected with Nathan's guidance. For George, nothing. Some boundaries remained uncrossable. And for Robert, after considerable deliberation, a rare first edition book on Chicago's architectural history that James had discovered at a used bookstore and carefully restored. Sarah's new apartment occupied the top floor of a renovated historical building in the Gold Coast neighborhood, smaller than the Lakeshore Drive mansion, but impeccably appointed, reflecting her refined taste and independent means. When James arrived, Emily greeted him with an enthusiastic hug, while Nathan offered a more restrained but equally sincere welcome. The gathering was smaller than previous years, just the immediate family, George and his companion Vanessa and Sarah's new boyfriend Stephen. The atmosphere carried an initial awkwardness as everyone navigated unfamiliar social dynamics, but the children's excitement about Christmas provided a unifying focus. James approached George with professional courtesy, offering a polite handshake that the older man reluctantly accepted. "Merry Christmas, George." "James." The acknowledgement was curt, but not openly hostile, progress of a sort. Robert arrived last, bearing elegantly wrapped packages and a bottle of vintage wine. His entrance momentarily heightened the tension, particularly for those who had witnessed the previous year's confrontation. But Robert moved through the room with composed dignity, greeting each person appropriately, his manner neither overly warm nor noticeably cold toward James. Dinner was served in Sarah's dining room, the table beautifully set with fine china and crystal. James noted that the seating arrangement had been carefully considered to minimize potential conflicts. George at one end, Sarah at the other, with strategic placement of the children and neutral parties between those with complicated histories. As dishes were passed and wine poured, conversation gradually relaxed into discussions of the children's activities. Stephen's upcoming exhibition at the Art Institute and the unusually heavy snowfall predicted for Christmas Day. The elephant in the room, last year's disastrous Christmas Eve, remained tactfully unacknowledged. Until Emily, with the unfiltered directness of a 12-year-old, suddenly asked, "Is everyone being extra nice because of what happened last year when Dad pushed Grandpa?" The table fell silent, forks pausing, mid-air, expressions freezing in varying degrees of shock and discomfort. Nathan shot his sister a warning look, but the question had been voiced, hanging in the air like fragile crystal. James set down his water glass carefully. "That's a very perceptive question, Emily." "You don't have to answer, James," Sarah interjected quickly. "This isn't the time or place." "Actually," Robert interrupted gently, "perhaps it is." He looked directly at Emily. "Yes, sweetheart. The adults at this table are being particularly mindful of how we interact because of what happened last year. That's not necessarily a bad thing." "But it feels fake," Emily persisted. "Everyone's pretending nothing happened, but it's all anyone's thinking about." From the mouths of babes, James thought, impressed by his daughter's emotional intelligence and courage. "You're right, Emily," he acknowledged, "and pretending isn't helpful." James looked around the table, meeting each adult's gaze briefly before continuing. "What happened last year was entirely my fault. I behaved inexcusably toward my father, disrespecting him in front of family in a way no one should ever be treated, especially not a parent who had given me every advantage in life." George shifted uncomfortably while Stephen, who had only heard secondhand accounts of the incident, listened with evident fascination. "The consequences of that night were severe and appropriate," James continued. "I lost much of what I had taken for granted, my position, my home, many material possessions, but I also gained something unexpected: perspective, humility, and a chance to rebuild relationships on more authentic foundations." He turned to Robert. "I will regret my actions that night for the rest of my life. Not because of what those actions cost me professionally or financially, but because they hurt someone I love and respect deeply." Robert's expression remained composed, though something shifted in his eyes, a subtle acknowledgement of the sincerity behind James's words. "Well," George said after an awkward pause, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional openness on display, "water under the bridge. Business matters shouldn't interfere with family holidays." "It wasn't just business, though, was it?" Nathan observed quietly. "It was about respect and consequences." "Exactly," Robert agreed, surprising everyone by engaging directly with the topic. "Actions have consequences, both positive and negative. Your father experienced severe consequences for a serious lapse in judgment, but he also demonstrated remarkable character in how he responded to those consequences. The validation, delivered publicly before family members who had witnessed both James's disgrace and subsequent struggle, carried profound significance. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement of growth, of lessons learned and applied. "I think," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm, "that Emily has given us all a gift by bringing honesty to the table. Perhaps that's the new tradition we should embrace, authenticity rather than pretense." "I second that," Stephen contributed, smiling at Emily. "Out of the mouths of babes, as they say." The tension-broken conversation resumed with a notably different quality, more genuine, less guarded. As the meal progressed, James observed the subtle dynamics between family members with new clarity. Sarah and Stephen shared an easy rapport that suggested genuine compatibility rather than rebound convenience. George remained somewhat stiff and formal, but made visible efforts to engage with the children about their interests. And Robert, while still reserved, allowed occasional glimpses of warmth to surface, particularly when interacting with Nathan and Emily. After dinner, as tradition dictated, the family gathered in Sarah's elegantly appointed living room to exchange gifts. The children's excitement created a contagious energy that helped bridge remaining awkwardness between the adults. When James presented Robert with the carefully wrapped book on architectural history, the older man examined it with genuine appreciation. "First edition Burnham," Robert noted, recognizing the volume's significance. "Where did you find this?" "A used bookstore in Rogers Park. The binding needed repair, but the content is intact." "Thoughtful and appropriate." Robert nodded, a gesture that conveyed more than mere politeness. "Thank you, James." In turn, Robert presented James with a small, plainly wrapped package. Inside was a vintage pocket watch, not new or expensive, but well-maintained and clearly selected with care. It belonged to your grandfather, Robert explained. He carried it through the Depression when he was working construction jobs across the Midwest, said it reminded him that even in the hardest times, life continues moving forward. The symbolism wasn't lost on James. The watch represented continuity across generations, persistence through hardship, and the steady progression of time, healing some wounds, transforming others into wisdom. Thank you, James said, simply, the words inadequate to express the significance of the gesture. As the evening concluded, guests departing into the snowy Chicago night, Robert and James found themselves leaving at the same time. They walked in companionable silence to the elevator, the year's journey from catastrophic breach to tentative rebuilding, evident in their relaxed postures and reduced guardedness. In the lobby, as they prepared to go their separate ways, Robert to his lakefront home, James to his modest apartment, father and son faced each other with new understanding. "Merry Christmas, James," Robert said, extending his hand. James accepted the handshake, recognizing it as both an ending and a beginning. "Merry Christmas, Dad." Outside, snow continued falling on the city, covering the old year's scars with fresh possibility. James Wilson stood for a moment watching his father's retreating figure, the pocket watch a solid weight in his coat pocket, a tangible reminder that while some chairs at some tables might forever remain empty, new seats at different tables awaited discovery. The past could not be changed, but the future remained unwritten, a blueprint waiting for careful hands to transform possibility into reality, one conscious choice at a time.